details on that later. Let's take a first look at Total War Warhammer 40K.
Oh my god, it's happening. It's actually happening! I'm sure everyone in the community is excited, right? So, hello there. If you've at all interacted with the Total War community, you might notice that it's pretty toxic in there. This is especially true among the historical fan as opposed to the fantasy fan. But why? Some people have even made a career out of complaining about Total War and its developer, Creative Assembly. Not that those two things doesn't deserve to be criticized, mind you. It's just that these videos wouldn't have gotten hundreds of thousands of views if the opinions expressed were a fringe opinion. So the question is, why? Why are Total War fans seemingly so cynical? And most importantly, what in the world did Creative Assembly do to make it this bad? Chapter 1. The reasons. If you're a Total War fan, you usually fall into two categories: a historical fan or a fantasy fan, based on which Total War games you prefer. So the historical fans like the Total War games set in a real historical setting, like in Rome 2, which is set in the ancient and rich world of classical Rome. Or Shogun 2, set in the exotic and fascinating world of late medieval Japan. Or there's Total War Thrones of Britannia, set in the desolate and depressing landscape that is Britain. Who asked for this? And if you're a fantasy fan, that means you prefer the Total War games in a fantasy setting, which basically just means that you like Warhammer because that's the only fantasy setting, right? Right? If you actually ask a Total War fan which games are considered fantasy and which one are considered historical, well, you get some very interesting opinions. Like, consider Total War 3 Kingdoms. At first glance, this should fall into the historical category, right? After all, it's set in a real historical period that exists in real life. But if you actually ask a historical fan, they'll say that yes, its setting is historical, but its gameplay is fantasy. In Total War 3 Kingdoms, there are these hero units, powerful individuals that represent the famous figures of the era, like Cao Cao, Zhao Yun, or Guan Yu. But these hero units, they're so powerful that they can solo multiple units, and sometimes, if you got the right setup, entire fucking armies. They can even go to these cinematic duels against other heroes and have this very convenient circle around them that everyone respects, because that's how it is in China, they're very polite. So, what about the next historical game, Total War Troy? Well, same stuff, historical setting, fantastical heroes. There's even mythical beast units in this one, making it even more dubious whether it's historical or not. So, what gives? What does this mean? Well, I think it means that it's not actually the setting which is the most important part of what differentiates a game from being historical or fantasy. It's actually the game design. Let's take a look at this video with hundreds of thousands of views and try to understand what it's trying to convey. Medieval 2, peasants reload weapons. Weapons fire. Warhammer. Weapons fire. Weapons fire again. Where's the reload? It's all automatic, buddy. Obviously, the video is trying to convey that the older historical games are better than the newer fantasy one. Now, whether you agree with this or not, I think you can agree that it perfectly encapsulates the difference between the two audiences. The historical fans want what I would call simulational spectacle. They want their battles to simulate real-world battles, the strategies, the logistics, everything. Fantasy fans want the spectacle of cool. What they want is giant robots and animals, recognizable characters battling hundreds and thousands of men alone, winning battles not through strategy but by summoning magic to kill your foes. In my Dragon Age video, which you can watch right here by the way, I explain how Failguard failed as a Dragon Age game, because even though Dragon Age is a franchise where every installment is very different than the last, there was still a core design which didn't change until Failguard. And when it did change, Dragon Age lost its identity. And in many ways, this simulational spectacle have always been the core design of Total War. I made it seem like the difference between the two groups of fans is fundamental, that the games are either for simulational spectacle or for the spectacle of cool. But it's a slider, you see, and it's a slider with a limit, because if you ask a fantasy fan, they will say that the strategic nature of the game is still one of the reasons they played it at all. There's a reason why Medieval 2, a 20 years old game, is more played today than other more modern Total War games. Because as more and more Total War games are released, this once bright and confident formula becomes more and more diluted, and its fans equally becomes more and more frustrated. And then Warhammer came. Total War Warhammer and its sequel, Warhammer 2, became an overnight success. It turned what once was a very niche strategy game franchise into one of the most recognizable and played franchises in the genre. It caused a whole influx of new fans who like the franchise for different things, but this wasn't really clear at the time. Historical fan or fantasy fan were labels that simply didn't exist at the time. Many of the older fans actually really liked the Warhammer games, and many of the newer fans equally respected the design of the old ones. All CA needed to do with this newfound success was to competently manage their own community. And honestly, they're a pretty huge company. I'm sure they would have no problem. Chapter 2: Neglect, Betrayal, and Hostility. CA, to be blunt, is absolutely dog shit at community management. It all began even before Total War Warhammer was even a thing, with the release of Total War Rome 2. That game was released in a very clearly unfinished state, with a lot of bugs, and it was just a very messy, which is a shame because I think Rome 2 might actually be the best Total War. Hot take, hot take. Then came the neglect. As the Warhammer game proved to be the main moneymaker for CA tried to integrate the two burgeoning communities by combining the strength of the older historical games with the new one. But they did this without listening to the community at all. Hey there, can I get Medieval 3? Nah, here's Thrones of Britannia. What? I want Medieval 3. Okay then, here's Three Kingdoms. Okay, this is actually pretty good, but can I still get Medieval 3? Troy. What the fuck? Worse is the DLC policy, because every major Total War game ever since Rome 2 has been completely inundated with endless DLCs. DLCs for extra campaigns that weren't really that good, DLC for extra factions that have very little difference with existing factions. DLCs for unlocking blood? What? This DLC policy have never been popular. Heck, even the release of Warhammer was filled with a controversy regarding a pre-release DLC. And worse, do you know what CA did when the inevitable criticisms came from members of the community? They blacklisted them. All of this creates a section of fans who grew resentful and bitter. Fans who are usually older and prefer the historical games. But why? Why would CA be this deliberately bad at managing their own community? Well, it's simple. CA has no competitors. They know that whatever they do, their fans would likely continue buying their games because it's a monopoly. But this, I think, actually played against CA, because with other fandoms, when you piss off a lot of them, they usually just leave and go somewhere else. But there's nowhere for Total War fans to go. And so what happened with these fans who once just had a preference for the older games? They coalesce into this new group called the historical fan. Being a historical fan suddenly isn't just a matter of preference. It became a political position characterized by the love of the old games, pro-consumerist position against CA, and deep-seated cynicism of CA's action. But CA didn't care. The historical fans were smaller than the fantasy one, and the fantasy fans were the main ones giving them money. So as long as CA can keep the fantasy fans happy, then nothing could go wrong. And so, just like that, CA has willingly let its own community turn into a powder keg waiting to explode. Chapter 3: The Reckoning. In October of 2023, it finally happened. It began when CA announced the next historical game, Total War Pharaoh, a game set in the Bronze Age, and again, a game that nobody, not even the historical fans, wanted. And then came the betrayal, a change in the pricing model of the new Warhammer 3 DLC. And because it's Warhammer, now they've pissed off the fantasy fans too. And then, the icing on the cake. Rob Bartholomew would make one of the most boneheaded statements I've ever read in my life. Publicly saying that, hey, you don't like that new pricing model? Well, go fuck yourself. This, ladies and gentlemen, pissed off everyone. And just like that, in a single month, CA committed all three of their vices: neglect, betrayal, and hostility. And then the powder keg turned into a nuclear bomb when the leaks came in. Spurred on by the massive backlash against CA, disgruntled employees began to become a little leaky, and not in the sexy way. In a video made by Volun, who is essentially the second coming of Jesus in the community after his video got DMCA'd into oblivion, the leaks basically aired out all of the dirty laundry of CA. The first is that CA deliberately focused on DLC because an analysis of Shogun 2 made them come to the conclusion that the market was not growing. And if they wanted to make more money, they needed to squeeze more out of its existing customers. The second is the technical debt. Ever since Empire all the way down to today, Total War has been made essentially with the same engine. But it's actually even worse than that, because it's actually the same code base. Essentially, and I'm very dumbing it down here, when CA wants to make a Total War game, they take their previous game, copy and paste it, and then work from there. As you can guess, this makes developing an actual game very difficult because, to be simplistic, the code is just too much of a jumbled mess. And then finally, a leaker admitted that CA deliberately ignored suggestions from the community.
Funny thing is, when Warhammer 3 was in development, they crossed out feedback, some creators. Your comments were usually redacted. Yours was mostly crossed out. That completely flies in the face of what Creative Assembly told me during early access. They just wanted me there to market the game, and that's not what I wanted. So they 100% lied.
And that was it. After the massive public backlash, Pharaoh became one of the least successful Total War games to date. Even after they released a free expansion which added Mesopotamia and integrated Pharaoh with Troy, it still sold very poorly. And with a lot of their money being put into a project which was ultimately cancelled, it really did felt like Creative Assembly wouldn't even survive the coming months. Chapter 4: The Aftermath. So, how is CA today? Well, as I said before, they almost got axed, with a lot of their employees being laid off, which is just... that sucks. The silver lining, though, is that Rob Bartholomew was also laid off, which is like, finally, dude. Now they've mostly been really quiet this past few years. That was until last week's Game Awards. Actually, it was a few days before, because in December 4th, CA would make a surprise announcement, a surprise at least for me, because they announced that finally they would be developing Medieval 3. But there was something fishy about this announcement. I wonder if you can guess it.
Today, we're thrilled to confirm that it's in early pre-production. Now, we are in early pre-production with Med3, and we're announcing early to take you on our development journey with us, where we can, via blogs and other updates. We've never announced something this early before.
That's right. The game is in early pre-production, which basically means that it's not being developed on at all. All in all, it was a very weird announcement, especially since they didn't showcase anything. There was no gameplay, no graphics, no cinematics. There wasn't even like a design sketch or anything. There was null. There was nothing. But it all made sense just a few days later. During the Game Awards, CA would announce Total War Warhammer 40k, an equally long-awaited game. But don't you think it's interesting that CA would announce the release of the two games the two different groups of fans have long been awaiting for? What I think happened is that CA, now desperately needing capital, both in terms of social capital and in terms of straight-up cash, decided that they should probably make the two games the two audiences have been asking for this past decade in Total War Warhammer 40k and in Medieval 3. But because the fantasy audience is larger than the historical one, they decided to develop Warhammer 40k first. But this time, they noticed the optics. The optics for the historical fan, having to endure another major announcement for another major fantasy game, and nothing for a historical Total War game. And so, they decided to do this shotgun announcement to placate the historical fan just a little bit, just a few days before they announced that they would be releasing Warhammer 40k. Now the cynical part of me think they did this just to stop the negative discussion, because now the historical fans can just say, hey, at least Medieval 3 is coming, right? But the more optimistic part of me is kind of glad. Glad because this shows that CA is learning. learning that neglecting a core part of their audience is a very bad idea, even if I think it's motivated in large part due to the rise of historical games, such as the one created by CA. And that's it for now. CA is alive but hurt. But since they're still alive, I really hope that they've learned from some of their mistakes. Especially because I think that if they don't, Warhammer 40k and Medieval 3 might actually be the last Total War games ever released. So, what's the conclusion to all of this? Well, first and foremost, is that maybe you shouldn't piss off your own audience? So, thanks a lot for watching the video. It was really fun to make, especially since I am a huge Total War fan, and if you can if you can guess from the bias that's very clear in this video, I am a historical fan. Last but not least, I'd like to say don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help the channel a lot, especially since I really want to keep doing this. It's really fun and I really like doing it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching, and I leave you to enjoy this silly dance of mine.